check to make sure that your device is muted. You should be able to see that in the lower left-hand corner, or if you're on a mobile device, maybe in the lower center of your screen. We are recording today's session, so we will have all the info available for you afterwards, including the chat box. And we're going to ask, just as an extra measure of redundancy, that we are going to be taking attendance just to verify that you came. So if you don't mind, in the chat box, if you could just put your name as it's listed on your AmeriCorps paperwork, and tell us where you're located within the state of Kentucky. You can say, I'm Andrew Stith, I'm in Frankfort, Kentucky with Serve Kentucky, the State Service Commission, or something like that. But let me know where you're at, and we'll get started in just a little bit. In us now, if you're just joining us now, please put your name and where you're located and your site in the chat box, because we will be taking attendance, and this is an extra measure of redundancy in case your name on your Zoom doesn't match the name in your personnel file. Hope you all are doing well today. I know it's had some inclement weather in the central and eastern part of the state, so I hope everybody's staying dry. We're really excited to start this second part of our disaster response and disaster service training. We've got a lot of info today, and we're going to get started in just a minute or two. If you haven't already, please put your name and the name of your service site and where you're located within the state in the chat box, so that way we can take attendance and give you credit for your participation. If you were here for the first part of the training that we had a couple weeks ago, we had a lot of good questions, and I think that we have an equal amount of people who are curious about this next part of the disaster cycle. So the format for today is we've divided this training basically into two parts. And so our presenter is going to go over the first. We'll have a brief break if you all have any questions, or if you need to get up and stretch your legs or something like that. And then we'll do the second part, and we'll have any follow-up questions after that. So we want to give you plenty of times to ask questions and to be engaged, but we are going to ask that you wait until the pauses in the presentation, just so we can keep the flow going and we can make sure that everybody gets their queries addressed. By my clock, it is now 11:05, so we are going to get started. Once again, if you haven't, if you're just joining us, please put your name, your service site, and where you're located within the state in the chat box, so we can give you credit for your participation. And we want to thank you for joining us for part 2 of our disaster training series, Preparedness and Mitigation in our service. We know there will be some technical difficulties that might occur, so we appreciate your patience and understanding. Once again, we have a lot of people who will be joining us today, so please make sure that your microphone is muted. Ambient noise can travel really quickly, and we want to make sure that everybody can hear clearly. We also have captions enabled, So if you do have any sort of issues with your device, you can always double check that you're muted and look for captions. My name is Andrew Stith, and I'm going to be moderating the session. We also have Carrie Kazar from Serve Kentucky Commission and Holly Stone from EKU who will be facilitating. We are going to be running a Zoom report for attendance tracking today. So if your screen name does not match the name that you used to register, please change it. Or like I said, please upload your information into the chat box so we can give you credit for your participation. Today's training is also being recorded. If you prefer not to have your face recorded, please use the stop video feature on your screen. And there will also be a short survey immediately following today's session. So please do not completely log out of Zoom and close your device down until you have completed it. It should only be a few questions, take you just a minute or so, but we really appreciate your input and your feedback because it helps us improve our process. So thank you for this. Today, for our presentation, I'd like to introduce Tim Brandewie. Tim came to the Division of Emergency Management in Fayette County in February 2004 to serve as the Metropolitan Medical Response Systems Coordinator, the MMRS. MMRS is an ongoing effort by the health, medical, and public safety community to plan for serious health and medical catastrophes in the Central Kentucky region, to develop systems for coordinating and providing critical care when and where it's needed, and to procure medicines and equipment. As Tim's duties have evolved, he's taken on more general planning duties for emergency response and recovery. And prior to joining the DEM, Tim served in the U.S. Navy for 20 years as an intelligence analyst and special operations officer. So if, with your screens muted, if you can join me in welcoming our presenter for today's session, Tim Brandewie.
Golf clap. Muted golf clap.
That's right.
Hey guys, as Andrew said, I'm Tim. I'm actually in the Fayette County Emergency Management Office. I work with Pat. I think you guys got the presentation from her the first time on the other half of the emergency and disaster management cycle. I'm going to be doing mitigation and preparedness. Going to talk about, let me share screen here. Okay, share screen. Ah, there we go. Ha! I've defeated it. They don't normally let me do technical stuff here at work. Okay. Can you guys see that all right?
Everything's looking good, Tim.
Okay. So today I'll be covering preparedness and mitigation. I'm actually going to start mitigation first, and I'll kind of explain that why a little bit later. Like I said, I was originally I was originally hired here under a Homeland Security grant, federal Homeland Security grant, because of my military background. I primarily worked in weapons of mass destruction and large-scale medical disasters. I've been the operations manager now here in Fayette County since about 2014. Been on a lot of responses, tornadoes, floods, ice storms, aviation disasters. And actually this cover slide here is the Graves County Courthouse in Mayfield, Kentucky. From December, I was part of the heavy rescue task force that rolled in there right after the strike. And I got to say, I've seen a lot of things in a lot of places in the world in my former career. I don't think I've ever seen devastation so complete. And we're going to kind of talk a little bit about some of the issues that impacted the damage and the recovery there. So with that, I think Andrew's pretty much covered, I think not so much the ground rules, but just kind of the logistics. I'm going to go through the mitigation part first, and then we answer any questions. I did receive everybody's questions in advance when you guys signed up to register. Any questions you had, I did get forwarded. I think I've answered most of them, but I'd be more than happy to clarify any other inquiries you've got or go into any new things. So let's go ahead and get started real quick. By the way, that's about the most substantially sound building in that whole county. That's the only reason that courthouse was even standing that well. And I've got some pictures later. So what are we going to talk about today? I've got a lot of slides, but I mean, I don't, I'm not going to drill down on them and, read everything, but I do believe it's important to understand some of the legal and governmental organizational frameworks that govern the way we respond, mitigate, and prepare and recover from disasters. So I'll touch on the disaster cycle real quick. I'll talk about the Stafford Act. which is really, it's kind of like the reference for all emergency management operations in the United States. And it governs not only the establishment of authorities, but also responsibilities at the local level. I'll talk about the difference between preparedness and mitigation briefly. The two are related, but they are really different things. And I know that can sometimes be confusing. Then I'll get into mitigation, the national mitigation program, how that filters down to Kentucky, and how that filters down to every county, and explain what those processes are, how it's done, and what are actual examples of mitigation activities. I'll talk about what we call HVA and THIRA, which is an analytical approach to determining the threats and hazards in your particular jurisdiction, because everybody's different. My challenges here in Lexington are a lot different than the challenges of some of you in Bell County. I saw some of you guys, we've got a lot of representation across the state. And while some threat issues are kind of uniform, some are very geography specific. And I'll touch on that. I'll look at some examples of mitigation projects that we've done here in Lexington. I'll then we'll pause for a second, see if you guys got any questions, and then I'll get into preparedness in general, what preparedness is, and then talk about preparedness programs, and also just a lot of home preparedness and how to have yourself ready, how to potentially volunteer, which you guys obviously already have, and basically kind of wrap that around to some of the measures that we've done here, some of the trainings we do here, like I'm doing right now. I teach preparedness classes in a variety of formats. And then we'll open it up to any questions you guys have at the end. All right. Now, I know Pat did preparedness and response. This is the standard disaster cycle. I've seen other variants of it that have a fifth component, but doctrinally, this is the 4 cycles. It's sometimes also called the emergency management cycle. I'm actually going to begin with mitigation and then work backwards, or correction, then work forwards to preparedness. All right, I know Pat did response and recovery, and the important thing to understand here, it's not just a visual that this is a continuous loop. I mean, I am still doing mitigation projects from disasters that happened here in Lexington 15 years ago, and at the same time, I'm preparing to respond to the crappy winter weather we're going to get here Saturday morning, and we are still going over our response and recovery efforts in Mayfield. So again, this is constantly ongoing, and you can have different emergencies or disasters in various states of this wheel all going at the same time, which is kind of what I do. It's kind of hard to see my slides. Let me get rid of these. Okay, here we go. I think one thing that's important to understand is the interrelationship between emergency management from the federal level on down to wherever you are, whatever county you're in, because these, for lack of a better phrase, this chain of command is extremely important as it relates to documentation, tasking, funding, reimbursement, rules. So obviously the overall federal head of emergency management is FEMA. FEMA is an outgrowth of the old Cold War civil defense construct. It was originally pretty much formed to prepare the United States for responding and protecting themselves from nuclear war, which unfortunately has become a topic of conversation again originally. So the old phrase civil defense, that whole initiative became ultimately what we know as FEMA. Now, FEMA administers the disaster and emergency programs through regional commands. We are in FEMA Region 4. And if you notice, Kentucky's right up there at the very edge. We're kind of an outlier in FEMA 4, because if you look at all the other states, for the most part, they're basically hurricane states. And that's really the big focus for FEMA Region 4. However, I will tell you that some of the first federal assets that came to assist us in Mayfield came out of Tennessee, where they had been staged primarily to respond to the Gulf Coast. So that whole relationship, FEMA 4 handles the responses and managing of assets. Then we come down to our own state, Kentucky Emergency Management. It is not a separate cabinet like it is in some states. That actually falls under military affairs. But they are a direct chain of command. Then down to us at the Lexington Emergency Management. And every one of your counties has an emergency management office, and they follow this same chain. But it's important to understand that this is how the tasking and the funding effectively works. Stafford Disaster Act. This is extremely important. This provides the legal underpinnings and authorities for how the United States will react in a disaster. And also, it was a combination of acts that, as you can see, were modified. And 88 was the initial, 06 was the last mod, post 9/11. And basically, this is what it outlines. It formally establishes a process for federal assistance and designates FEMA as the lead, period. The main things also at a local level for preparedness for us is it establishes the national level programs and standards that everyone will adhere to. So we have common terminology, common equipment typing, basically setting standards across the country so we can all have, a similar playbook to work from. It spells out the legal authorities for emergency declarations, which is extremely important because declaring emergencies at a state and local level, inherent in that is the authority, if necessary, to suspend other normal regulations or laws. And so in order to keep that all legally clean, there has to be a very specific process which has to be followed to declare an emergency so that we can loosen certain regulations. We can, hypothetically utilize civilian assets for a government purpose, things of that sort. And it's very clearly defined how to do that legally. It also clarifies the role of the United States military in disaster assistance. I think if many of you, may be aware, post-Civil War, we have a federal law in this country called the Posse Comitatus Act, which restricts the utilization of the United States military to conduct operations inside the continental United States. Not just security, but the ability to take airfields, the ability to utilize warships, helicopters. And so during a disaster, those authorities are loosened for the purpose of allowing the Department of Defense to assist. And the Department of Defense is a huge force multiplier. Obviously, if you've ever seen, usually the first assets that can get to any place are either National Guard if it's inland, or it's the Navy and the Marine Corps if it's in a coastal area, because we have the helicopters, we have the equipment, we can get there quick. Also, financial regulations and financial reimbursement procedures. And at the bottom line in red I have on there, it requires local plans for preparedness, alert, warning, responsibilities. This in the Stafford Act is what dictates to all of us at the local level governmentally that we must maintain emergency management programs. And then there's a lot more specifics to that. But it all rolls back up to the authorities in the Stafford Act, which is extremely important. I'm going to basically mitigation and preparedness. A lot of people view it as kind of the same thing. It's not really. This is kind of like these are the textbook definitions from FEMA. So you guys can read that. Mitigation is defined as sustained action to reduce or eliminate risk. And that's really the operative words right there. Preparedness is a continuous cycle of planning, training, organizing, equipping, to ensure effective coordination during an incident response. To me, I think the easiest distinction to put this is mitigation is generally very specific actions, like we put a tornado shelter here. That is a mitigating action. We improve our flood defenses. That's a mitigating action. Preparedness is a cycle of analyzing, training, preparing, equipping. So that's why it's listed as a separate component of the overall disaster cycle. Basically, mitigation is how do we reduce or eliminate risk? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Now, there is a federal document that clarifies mitigation activities in the United States. It's as the slide says there, the Mitigation Act of 2000. And basically what that does is it separates out from the overall Stafford Act, FEMA authorities and guidelines, the very specific function of mitigation. And it mandates that every jurisdiction has to have a mitigation plan. And what that, because you must maintain a mitigation plan in order to be eligible for post-disaster funding. I can tell you now, FEMA is placing an incredible amount of emphasis on preparedness and mitigation, and they make decisions on how to reimburse jurisdictions based upon how well they were prepared. Meaning that if you didn't have a plan and you should have had a plan and this was a noticeable threat, the government's not going to necessarily keep bailing everybody out. They're putting the requirement on the locals, as it should be, to strengthen their preparedness and mitigation programs. In a mitigation process, the key thing is identifying your hazards, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Like I said, it varies widely. I grew up on the Gulf Coast of Florida as a kid. My biggest fear was lightning and hurricanes, especially hurricanes. I remember getting my grandma out of a place on a bayou where I grew up a few times. I don't worry about hurricanes up here, and I sure as heck didn't worry about ice storms down in Florida. So it's very specific to where you live and also your infrastructure. Mitigation plans also require multi-stakeholder involvement. That includes business, government, volunteer agencies, pretty much across the board. We're required to have a process which brings in stakeholders to come up with an agreed plan of action. And finally, encourages equitable planning processes by including stakeholder involvement in vulnerable populations. For example, Lexington has a large non-English speaking population, and we actually have a very close partnership with our Global Lexington Engagement Center to help us and advise us on how and where to tailor our preparedness messages and activities for people that perhaps English is a second language. Okay, so what is mitigation in plain English? What can I do to minimize death and damage to my community? And what are some of those strategies that we can utilize? Well, prevention to an extent. I mean, there's not a whole lot of threats you can prevent. Some you can, construction standards, things of that sort, to try to make, construction less vulnerable to destructive weather, for example. Zoning laws can help to prevent if we don't allow people to build in areas that can flood a lot. All right, so that's a type of prevention. Property protection, hardening facilities to the extent that we can. There's a large emphasis on that at the national level to harden structures from tornadoes and flooding. Same thing with structural projects, natural resource protection, levees and dam systems that can help control not just our relationship with the environment, but flooding, emergency services, public information. Again, there's usually very specific activities that are conducted that are specific to your jurisdiction. This is actually pictures from the flooding down here on the Kentucky River last February, actually. So how do we begin a mitigation process? Every jurisdiction has to have one. Cities do, tribal jurisdictions do. Everyone has to have one, and it all starts with identifying what's your hazard. All right, and as I indicated before, hazards vary tremendously by location, but also geography and physical infrastructure. If I'm primarily a rural county with not much industry, my threat profile is a little bit different than if I've got, the University of Kentucky, 6 hospitals, 2 major interstates, 2 rail lines, large amounts of commerce, industrial production, utilizing hazardous materials. I mean, my threat focus is going to be a little different. There's 2 processes to do this. In the past, it was called HVA, or what we call a hazard vulnerability assessment. The new buzzword is THIRA, which is Threat and Hazard ID and Risk Assessment. What I would say is that THIRA is a more community-oriented process, which we look at the overall community, and that includes, like I said, business, education, communications, everything. HVAs are generally done more by specific agencies. For example, every hospital has to have an HVA, a standalone HVA. Now, they reference their county's THIRA, but every hospital by federal regulation has to have an HVA that takes into account their local circumstances. And so here's my kind of quickie slide on how to explain our THIRA process. Again, you identify the likely hazards in your area. I'm not talking the planet-killing asteroid or the brain-eating aliens from Neptune. I mean, you kind of got to figure out what's likely, what's not, and prioritize your efforts. So when you identify your hazards, what that really means is what could happen in your area. And that's what we call the threat. We live in a very vulnerable area winter weather-wise for ice storm. Historically, we just do, because we're right usually on that dividing line of the jet stream and then the cold air that comes from the north. Every time this time of year, you get a weather front come through. Same thing with tornadoes. We're right on that same line. I didn't worry that much about it, when I lived in California, for example. Now, vulnerability is how vulnerable are we? In other words, what are things about my community that just make me naturally vulnerable? If I am a smaller town in rural Kentucky, say in Eastern Kentucky, and I live in a pretty low-lying area because towns were developed along the rivers and the creeks. Well, I'm obviously extremely vulnerable to flooding. Now, what is the risk? Risk is what is the probability of a bad outcome based upon our vulnerability and our hazards. And basically, kind of the equation we use is your hazards, which you can't change your hazards. Those are facts of just where you live, what your weather is like, what your terrain is. You cannot change the hazard. How vulnerable are you? And then that equals what your overall risk is. And we actually have mathematical models that calculate and come up with numeric values for a variety of things. So I'll give you an example. For the state of Kentucky, historically, the absolute #1 hazard in Kentucky is flooding. We rank like on the top 4 nationwide for total numbers of disaster declarations over the last 20 years across the country in total numbers. And most all of those are flooding. And I think you can understand why. Look at our terrain, right? And look at our river systems. However, where I work in Lexington, we're actually on a plateau. We're in one of the highest points in central Kentucky. And in fact, Lexington, Fayette County is the headwaters for about 5 or 6 major creek systems that fan out around us. And those counties around us are at lower elevation. So I don't really have that much flooding here ever. I just don't. A lot around the Kentucky River, we have very limited frontage between Valley View and Clays Ferry, maybe 10 miles, 15 miles, and it's all palisade cliffs, and we don't develop much there. So my flooding risk is not much. But all my neighbors, Woodford County, Scott County, Madison County, they have tremendous flooding risk. And unfortunately for like Woodford and Scott and Clark, a lot of their flooding risk comes from creeks whose headwaters are in my county. But I don't flood. The water heads downhill towards them because we're on a plateau. So that's just an example of how much of a difference that makes. Most of Kentucky's mitigation efforts are focused on flooding. That's less my concern. Now, just to understand how the federal government views national level vulnerabilities, okay, what we call type 1 disasters. #1 on the US's list for the most part, as far as total destructive damage, is hurricanes. And FEMA Region 4, of which, like I said, we're just kind of the footnote attached to FEMA Region 4 in the Southeast, is primarily focused on hurricane relief. And I think we all understand why, just because of the massive scale of not just the devastation, but the massive geographic footprint of that kind of devastation, okay? Earthquakes, I would say, is #2. The primary areas at a national level, obviously, are Southern California and the West Coast. And actually, we do have a seismic zone in the Kentucky River border area with Missouri and Illinois called the New Madrid seismic zone. It's a different tectonic process. It's not like the plate earthquakes you get in California where I used to live. This is a different issue. Now, that hasn't slipped in almost 200 years significantly, but we do have minor earthquakes there every day, and it is still considered a risk, and FEMA classifies it as a risk. Nationally, flooding. Every single year, it seems, you look anywhere up along the Mississippi Basin and feeder rivers during, excessive snow melt and everything, large scale flooding, large wildfires, which obviously are becoming more and more of an issue out west because of the scale, because of climate, because of the difficulty in being able to attack something that geographically large. And I think we've all seen a lot of that. So those are really the 4 biggies probably for the federal government as far as natural disasters. And then we'll also have to take a look at potential man-made or technological issues. Obviously, post 9/11, terrorism became quite an emphasis. In fact, that's why I got hired. I just transitioned from counterterrorism work, and at the time, the federal government was looking for people with that kind of background, and a lot of us moved into emergency management. So obviously, terrorism preparedness is very high up on the new preparedness goals for the country. Obviously, improvised nuclear attack, which that's not much you can do about that one. Bio was an emphasis and still is. I would say not just bio attack, but as we've seen also pandemic. And this is my third, technically my second pandemic I've worked since I got out of the military. We had H1N1 the first time, but all the preparedness systems and response systems for bio attack, I mean, all that effort we invested in procurement in my first 10 years here paid off when the pandemic hit, because it's the same issues: PPE, hospitalizations, maintaining essential health care, having those systems for pre-hospital transportation, quarantine and isolation rules and laws. So a lot of that work has benefited us when it comes to pandemics. Okay, now that's the national level. At the Kentucky level, as a state, this is the overall menu list of what are considered the primary hazards in Kentucky. Now, if you look at this list, depending upon where you live in Kentucky, you'll be like, well, I don't have that worry. But some of you will be like, well, I do have that worry, and you can see kind of the karst and sinkhole issues. If you guys remember, what, about 5 years ago, was it, out in Bowling Green, the Corvette Museum dropped into a sinkhole? The entire area did. I grew up in central Gulf Coast of Florida. Sinkholes would eat up houses all the time in my community. It just happens. You can't get away from it. There are parts of Kentucky that are vulnerable to that also, obviously more towards the western part of the state. The rest of the mine subsidence. Now, I don't have mines here, but people in eastern Kentucky do. And some of these mine systems and containment measures can fail. That's a hazard. So again, most of those dam failures, we've got a fair amount of dams here in Kentucky. A lot of them are old. Dick's Dam in my area is the oldest dam in the state, 1927. And so all those are potential hazards in Kentucky. Now in Lexington, we just redid every 4 years, you have to redo your mitigation plan by law. And we redid ours in 2018. And these were kind of our ranked hazards for Lexington. Number one for us was destructive weather in the variety of forms. Tornadoes and thunderstorms, pretty self-explanatory. My coworkers are making faces at me through the windows trying to throw me off track. I will not be off track. Except, tornadoes and thunderstorms. Everybody worries about tornadoes. I will tell you that in my 18 years here, I have seen a lot more damage from straight line wind thunderstorms than I've seen from tornadoes, just cumulatively. We do occasionally get tornadoes. They're bad, but historically we have usually been fairly lucky, and that just because of the rural makeup of our state, it hasn't caused tremendous damage to populations. However, straight line thunderstorms tear buildings up every year. And I would say overall, now, the worst kind of damage, obviously, is tornadoes. If you'd have told me a year ago that I would ever respond to an EF4 tornado strike in Kentucky in December, I'd have said you were crazy. And that's literally what happened a couple of months ago. So as the prevalence of tornadoes increases due to climate, and also due to our expansion of infrastructure into areas that are more vulnerable, that's a big concern. Winter weather threats. Honestly, my number one threat is ice. Snow is an inconvenience. Snow slows transportation. Slow makes everything harder. I'm not minimizing the potential human services effect of snow and mobility impacts, but for the most part, snow doesn't drop the power grid. Ice drops the power grid. And that's my biggest fear in the winter, because if I start losing power, then people start losing home heating. Businesses start to go down. Most of our healthcare systems are pretty well protected by backup power. but very little else is. And if I start to lose power in Lexington due to a major ice storm and the outages are expected to last more than 48 hours, I'm potentially looking at significant numbers of my population, thousands of them, that I've got to find someplace warm for them to sleep at night. That's one of my biggest concerns. Plus the impact on communications infrastructure when towers go down or power to those towers go down. So that's my big threat here in the winter. Hopefully, I'm about to leave that threat. We have one more round of winter weather. Hopefully, it'll be the last one this Friday night here in Lexington, and so we'll see. Now, Lexington has a higher than average hazardous materials vulnerability for a couple of reasons. Number one, we have two major U.S. interstates cross through our county, I-64, which runs from the Atlantic out to somewhere in the Midwest I don't care about. All I know is that a lot of stuff comes through here. And I-75, which is the most heavily traveled commercial interstate in the United States. A lot of people don't realize that. More goods go up and down I-75 than any other interstate in the country. So because of that, and Lexington being a hub, we have trucks coming into town on 64 or 75 and then using New Circle to switch, and go north, south, east, west. So we're kind of like a turntable for routing of heavy traffic. And inevitably, very large amounts of hazardous materials get trucked over the road. 99% of it never has a problem. But because of my higher risk, we have factored that into a lot of our preparedness activities. In addition to interstates, Lexington has two major national rail lines to come through. We have Norfolk Southern. I said Norfolk as someone who used to live there. That is the correct pronunciation. It's Norfolk, Norfolk Southern, and CSX. Now, by sheer tonnage, the rails move more hazardous materials than trucks. Safety records are fantastic. I did, however, respond to a pretty significant train derailment here about 4 years ago. It was just over my county line into Scott County. It was a collision between two trains on a track. It happened on a section of track that was so rural, we had to get off road to go find it. And it did cause a lot of derailed cars. Thankfully, the cars that had hazardous materials were in the back by design. So the whole front half of this train got smashed and tossed around this guy's farm, but the more dangerous cargoes were protected. But as a result, I have to plan for that. So we have response protocols. I keep track of where development is close by the rail lines. Now, again, you live down in, some other county where you don't have much rail or interstate traffic. It's not really going to be your hazard, but it's mine. Other hazardous materials issues, industrial. Lexington's a large manufacturing area. And as a result, many processes utilize hazardous materials or what we call extremely hazardous substances in the production processes. So obviously industrial accidents are a concern. We have a very large, by large, I mean, for this whole mid southeast region, we have a very large oil terminal here that a lot of people aren't aware of. A major pipeline comes in and we have a large oil tank terminal over here on Old Frankfurt Pike. And that supplies gasoline and other petroleum products to several states. And if something impacts that, not just what is it a threat to our environment, it's a threat to the entire regional economy. So, and then for those of you who are down at EKU and Berea and the surrounding area, you're perhaps familiar with the chemical weapons stockpile. The last remaining U.S. stockpile of nerve agent weaponry is in the Bluegrass Army Depot in Berea. Right outside Madison. We're in the process of finishing up the destruction of those weapons. They've been around, some of them since the 50s, but it is an inherent hazard and risk that we practice for all the time. I mean, it's something we work every single day. We do contests, we review our plans, we review what's going to happen today, how many weapons are they working on, what's the threat for today. So that's kind of again, that's more of a unique hazardous materials threat to central Kentucky than it is to Owensboro. I mean, this is unique in the whole country right now with the last nerve agent storage area. Now, when we go through our mitigation processes and we come up with a whole list of threats and priorities and ranking, and then we come up with what we call action matrix. Some of our action items can be by updating our codes, redoing city ordinances. It could be in tornado shelters. We have procured some commercial grade tornado shelters for some of our vulnerable government facilities, like you see at the bottom left-hand of the screen. That tornado shelter there can hold about 100 people, because that building behind it is a very large recycling facility that we have a lot of people in, and it is made out of just sheet metal and metal framing, and it has been damaged in the past. And because it has been damaged in the past by storms, and we've documented that, we got the funding to go ahead and install a shelter to protect them because of the type of construction that they're in. Other examples are siren systems. In the top right of this slide, that's the latest siren that we've installed here in Lexington. We have 30 of them. This one's out in Heisel Park. We have a system of these around the county, primarily designed to warn people that are already outside. And that's kind of a misunderstanding. If you lived in Kansas or Oklahoma, their siren systems are designed to wake up people from the grave, no matter where you are. Ours are not really designed like that. They're designed to warn people that are outside to seek cover. And that's, again, based upon our threat. But I would say each one of these systems turnkey is about $35,000 a piece. But we get support funding from the federal government because it is a mitigation measure. So we have them in our major parks, our major outdoor venues like the Horse Park, University of Kentucky. So we can warn people that are outside. Other examples are what we call flood buyouts. Now, we don't have as many here, but over time, and for those of you who live in Eastern Kentucky, I'm sure you can relate, there are certain places that are going to flood. And if every 4 years, FEMA is having to come in and provide a disaster assistance to, say, the house here in the middle of this slide, which is down off Beach Road here by Clay's Ferry. If every 4 years this house floods and the government's paying out disaster assistance, eventually you get to a cost benefit analysis, and the federal government gives us funding to buy that property. And then when we do, we raise it, get rid of the structure, try to backfill it with absorbing materials, and basically make it a green space. That is a very active program in other parts of Kentucky. We've done it some because we have some low-lying areas in town here in Kentucky that have historically had trouble. We've actually bought some properties and just turned them into green spaces. That is a mitigating measure. People aren't going to be harmed there. We're not going to continue to be paying money to try to recover something. And I will tell you that the federal government is getting much harder about this. And I say that out of sympathy for my shipmates who live probably more in Eastern Kentucky. These repetitive loss properties, the feds are really getting to the point where they're squeezing local jurisdictions to either get people to move and buy them out. And I realize how sensitive that is culturally. My wife's family's from Eastern Kentucky, and I mean, generations of people have lived in some of these places, but it's becoming an issue and it's getting worse with the increased severity of flooding. So, but that is a mitigation measure to do buyouts. Other things we do include backup generating power to critical government facilities like communications facilities. In this case, this is our fire training center, which also is our backup EOC. So if something struck my EOC hard enough that we could not operate here, I would have to shift a couple miles down the road to this building. Well, it didn't have a backup generator. So we made the case to FEMA and they got us a backup generator. So again, these are just examples of some of the concrete measures that can be taken as part of your mitigation process. And before we shift over to preparedness, I think the biggest emphasis I want to make is mitigation measures really are locally dependent. And I think I've tried to point that out. It depends where you are, what your hazards are, and how vulnerable are you to those hazards. Like I said, the majority of the mitigation money in the state of Kentucky that the federal government provides goes to flooding projects. It just does, just because of percentage-wise losses in Kentucky have been by flooding. That can be improving sewer systems. It could be improving water management systems. It could be buyouts, for flooded areas, reinforcing government facilities. There's the Emergency Operations Center in Frankfurt sits right next to a flood wall. And if that flood wall tops or breaks, that building was built with flood barriers in the construction to at least keep the water out of the building so they can run emergency services, just to give you an idea. So let me see here. Well, I'll tell you what, that's kind of the mitigation part. So I'd be happy to answer any questions people got about mitigation in general. If I'm not muted or something. Hold on.
Thanks for all the info, Tim. This is really eye-opening just because, one, we tend to think of disasters as being these really, the kind of like act of God that you hear about. But from what you're saying, it sounds like there's a lot of more common things that actually yield way more frequent damage and more problems for our region.
Yeah. Hazard in my case, it's hazardous materials. It's thunderstorms. I'd be happy to entertain any questions people have on mitigation and mitigation systems in the state.
So I'm gonna ask a question that probably some people are thinking, but not sure what to. So actually, Tammy Baker in our chat said, "How do we find out about our local plans?" So how does because our members are spread out across the state, we're in 100 of 120 counties in Kentucky. So how do our individual members find out who's in charge of their plans, where they can get a look at those plans, all that kind of stuff?
Sure. By law and by Kentucky KRS 39, and again, coming down from the Stafford Act, the local emergency management office, and for most counties, it's going to be a county office. So your local emergency management officer for the county is required by law to maintain the mitigation plan. They're also required to make it available. A lot of people put them online. It just depends on how your county is structured. But all you really have to do, is contact your emergency management office and say, "Hey, I would like to see our mitigation plan." It is by law required to be made available to the citizens. And even every 4 years when they're updated, they're supposed to invite citizen groups in. But if you want information on it, your local emergency management office by KRS maintains it and has to make it available if you're interested.
Tim, I've got a question for you from one of our members. Is there any way, when we're talking about mitigation, is there any way where we can kind of speculate about the cost that goes into these buyouts and all this preparedness versus the actual cost of like reconstruction and rebuilding when a disaster strikes?
Every time and mitigation money becomes available after a disaster, that's kind of the point. So what happens is, like see in the middle of this screen on the top, those are the floods last year. As a result of that, the state of Kentucky offered mitigation grant funding opportunities through the federal government. It is a very laborious process to apply. And within it is a consistent emphasis on cost benefit analysis. Also on, is there an alternative course of action you can take here? You got to go through a lot of hoops. And, sometimes after you do the math, it's just easier to say, well, this property over 15 years has had this many losses equaling this much money. It is forecasted that based upon, the climate or whatever, it's going to continue. So the smarter thing is just buy it out. Other examples could be, no, we can't afford to buy you that Cadillac giant generator because you don't need one that big. What you actually need is something to run your comms, or you know what I mean? So it's a constant cost benefit, and it's factored into every level of the approval process. When I apply for projects, and I've got 5 of them ongoing right now, which is keeps me busy. I have to be able to justify every single one that it is the more cost efficient way. And then the state decides if it agrees with me. The state then sends it to FEMA 4, Region 4, see if FEMA 4 agrees before the feds sign off on it. So it's they dig in. You have to really justify what you're doing.
Yeah. So Tammy asked, is the federal government also applying the same thinking to wildfires in California? And I'm assuming she means the idea that, these areas consistently catch fire. And so people are building homes here, especially these large $1 million homes.
Yeah. And I live in Southern California for about 7 years. And I'm out in the neighborhood I used to live in. It burned down about 10 years ago. Completely to the ground, strip mall, the neighborhood, all gone. And Out west, the biggest problem is, in addition to nature, is development and restriction on development. And then you start to run into some brutal economic realities versus risk realities. I'm not speaking for California, but most of the biggest fires we've had lately have been, granted, people have built out further into the high deserts or into the hills, but it's just been the scale of them and how they're moving, that they're hitting established towns. It's not just that the person that builds the mansion up in the hills above Santa Barbara that's getting burned out anymore, although that's a problem. And it's a really sensitive issue in California when it comes to state zoning. And the feds pretty much require the state to come up with a solution for that. And it's not an easy one. If you've ever lived in Southern California, I mean, I have a 10 by 10 foot office that would probably cost me $1,000 a month in San Diego if I was renting it right now. So that's why people are moving further out. I believe that the bigger strategic problem threat with the West wildfires lately is just how many of them are impinging upon large towns. These aren't places that were built out in the hills. And the emphasis on utility management and regulation. Some of these fires, unfortunately, are caused by power transmission lines, that spark or a lightning strike. And they're doing as much as they can to protect property. But I think the biggest emphasis is probably on alert and warning out west. The feds are dumping money into improving emergency alert and warning. I actually teach a class on the fire in Paradise, California from 4 years ago, and how I don't want to say delay, but how the nature of communicating that didn't get out fast enough, and it killed like 30 people, destroyed an entire town, razed it to the ground. And I think those are the mitigation efforts they're trying to apply. To answer your question, yes, Western wildfire is a big deal. And it's not just some rich guy building up in the hills. They're getting big enough now that they're moving across Colorado and places and burning whole towns.
Victoria, you can unmute, ask your question.
Yeah. Hi, Tim. I'm curious about a couple of things. One, regarding the CERT program, we learned about that before, but I know it's also a part of mitigation. I reached out to my local county emergency manager, and he was not aware just yet. He's new here, of how I would find out for my local CERT program, but I'm just curious if you would know how I could find my local one myself.
Most of the CERT programs are administered by county EM. Not every county has one.
We don't.
Now, some counties participate in a regional structure. Like, for example, I know that some parts of the state have got a regional CERT program. Like a couple of counties around will combine. What county are you in?
Boyle County.
Boyle.
Mm-hmm.
Have you already contacted Mike Wilder? See if they've got
He's
a CERT.
retired. He's retired.
Well,
Yeah.
I better update my contact list. Okay.
It was actually Perivale's mayor is now taking the position, and since everything has been
Got you. All right.
happening so much lately, he's been very busy.
I got you. Okay.
It's Brian Caldwell.
I have a
Okay,
question.
I'm trying to
Tim. I don't know if this occurs a lot in Kentucky or not. And I know some states are starting to look at this, but some universities have kind of disaster preparedness plans and things like that. Boyle County, that's where Center
Bluegrass.
is, right?
Yeah.
So you might contact somebody at the university and see if they won't have necessarily may not have a CERT program, but they might have some sort of disaster piece that they are looking for people to help with, not just students maybe, but I don't know if that's one of the AmeriCorps groups that we work with. They're piloting, or they're starting to have conversations about how do we get, because a lot of our communities have some sort of community college or university, and how do we get our citizens, our normal citizens, together with these universities to make a plan, especially in these smaller communities where you don't necessarily have, your emergency management office in Boyle County is probably literally one person,
It is.
whereas, when you talk about some of the larger infrastructure organizations like universities, you might find that they are a part of a plan, and you can maybe get into being a part of their plan.
Yeah, and University of Kentucky has a CERT program, for example. Now, usually a lot of those are kind of based on people that are connected to the university. Now, here in Lexington, you don't have to be a Lexington resident. If you work in Lexington, you're eligible for our classes. But unfortunately, in some of the rural areas, the next best thing I could think of, if it's not technical CERT, which is a very specific curricula, is the Red Cross chapter. They do preparedness training, but it's not a full-blown CERT. So unfortunately, I don't know, with Mike being gone, generally that is organized at a local level through the EM office.
Okay. Yeah, I was talking to him about looking for resources for search and rescue, and we don't seem to have anything out here.
Well, SAR
Yeah.
is also done, and you can, you've got my contact information, you can send more, but there are also SAR organizations that are kind of regional. Not every county has a search and rescue team.
Right.
But there are regional ones, like the one that works over in the Wolfe County area, handles all the Red River Gorge stuff. Lexington has obviously a pretty significant capability, and usually if there's a problem like that down in Boyle County, we come. And I've been down there before for stuff. So with respect to that, there are some civilian, for lack of a better term, SAR entities. But once you guys get a replacement for an EM down there, that's probably still your best bet. But in the interim, Red Cross, maybe contact center, like she said, that's about all I can think of. Carrie, you want me to go on, crank out the rest of the slides? That way I can start.
Yeah, I'm going to ask, we've got one more question in the chat. I'm going to ask you, and then we'll move on. It's Shelby asked, when it comes to situations like pandemics, is that when it's more under the public health scope and not considered by definition a disaster? Just curious on where that line is drawn and who or what offices are at the head of response in Kentucky.
That obviously was an issue starting in 2020. Doctrinally, we declared an emergency. Now, there's a difference between an emergency and a disaster. It's subtle, but there is a difference. We rely on the public health officer to declare, based on his or her opinion, that this outbreak is an emergency to the safety of the population. Okay. Once that happens, then we use that as our reference as a civil government to then put in place a state of emergency. And we put stipulations on why we're doing it. So the two kind of go hand in hand, because once the health department or the public health system starts to recommend measures like staying at home, like shutting school, like don't go to work, then things start to become, okay, now we have a continuity of operations issue now here in the county, which we participate in. We actually became the hub and the clearinghouse, my division, for the acquisition of PPE for the whole county, to include the hospitals, because everybody and their brother was trying to get PPE, for example. And having lived through this before, I warned my government and my hospital systems when I first saw the cases starting to bubble up out of China. I said, because we have a very good relationship between EM and the public health here. I warned them, I said, you better be buying every N95 you can get right now, gloves, everything, because they're going to be gone. And they were. But then we acted as a coordinating measure. So to answer the question directly, a public health issue, the determination of how serious it is, we do rely on the public health community, but we're not separate. I'm on Zooms with them still 3 times a week talking about COVID. So we work together, we utilize their authority, because believe it or not, under federal and state law, even though obviously it was litigated a lot this last few years, public health officials have pretty wide ranging powers. They really do. But it's much more effective if it's synchronized with the local government. And so in this case, Dr. Humbaugh declared he didn't even want to. We waited for the state to declare it. And sometimes that'll be a
Stack.
Yeah, the new guy, Dr. Stack. Dr. Stack basically said, yep, this is an emergency for the state of Kentucky. Then all the public health commissioners said, yep, we agree. And then that gave us at a government level some backing and also some legal authorities to start doing things. Like we amended our contracting and purchasing rules. I didn't have to go out and get 3 quotes. I needed freaking masks right now. Okay, so now because we're in an emergency, I can go buy them. It's just kind of give you an idea of how that interrelationship works.
Excellent. Thank you for answering that question.
Okay. Well, let me go ahead and crank out these final slides. A lot of them are self-explanatory. I did forward a copy of this if anybody wants it in PDF of these slides, but I'm going to talk about preparedness real quick. Obviously, why do you got to be prepared at the local level? It's kind of obvious. I think everybody's heard, the saying, be prepared to take care of yourself for 48, 72 hours. Well, it's the same thing as a city. We need to be prepared as a city to take care of ourselves between like 48, 72 hours before the federal government can get here. I saw that firsthand in Mayfield. I mean, elements of the feds got there to help, but basically you got to have a plan to make it on your own. And again, this is kind of the bottom line. We will be overwhelmed in the event of a major disaster. We being the public safety apparatus, we're going to get to everything as best we can. But I'll tell you, after what I saw in Mayfield, as an extreme example, there was no public safety apparatus. It was gone. Fire station gone. Police station was gone. The water tower was gone. The E911 communication tower was gone. There was nothing. There was nothing left that they could even respond with. So again, that's an extreme example, but being prepared at home is what's important first. Do the best you can, and I'll be honest with you, for people like me, or if you're a nurse or you're a firefighter or someone who has to respond during an emergency, you can't keep your head in the game if you're worried about your own home not being prepared. All right. And we place a big emphasis on that. Make sure you're prepared. You can't do your job if you're wondering if because you got to stay home and take care of your family. Now, how can you get prepared? That's a whole nother day's worth of classes we teach in general. But just some basic tips is, recognize, take responsibility for yourself and your family. I mean, I know that sounds kind of trite to say that, but some things are common sense. The government cannot do everything for everybody in a disaster. You just can't. And so part of our whole focus on preparedness is to get people to be better prepared to take care of their own needs as long as they can before it becomes an issue where they need government intervention or public safety intervention. Know the hazards and the risks that you face. We just talked about all that. Okay. We're in the middle of Severe Storms Preparedness Month right now. Every March, this is the season that tornadoes start to pop. And so we're going to be doing a very heavy information campaign, actually under a mitigation grant. I've got 1,400 of these Midland weather radios delivered on 5 pallets sitting in the hallway outside my office right now, because we're going to distribute one of these Midland weather radios to every single mobile home in the county, because we recognize that is the most vulnerable population in our county if a tornado hits. So, but the key thing is know your warning methods and know what hazards you face. Like I said, I'm not worried about flooding here. Generally, it's inconvenient at rush hour, but it's, in Nicholas County a year and a half ago up in Carlisle, it wiped out their entire town in like an hour. That freak rainstorm, and it wiped out their city garage, their fire station, flooded every business, every home downtown. So understand what your risks are. There are a lot of online references. We make some about creating a family plan and a family disaster kit. I grew up in Florida, as I indicated before, on the Gulf Coast. And, I guess I didn't realize it was a family disaster kit, but my mom always kept jugs of drinking water, canned food, extra batteries in a shelf above flooding in the garage. And every 6 months she'd swap it out. If hurricane was coming, we'd fill a tub up with water before water got knocked out so we could have water to flush with. It just kind of depends on where you're at. Assemble a kit. We'll talk about that. Discuss specific needs and limitations with your neighbors. I know that's kind of passe nowadays, but understanding your neighbors depends upon your situation. I know I've got a couple elderly neighbors. I've actually gone and checked on them before during, when we've been iced in before. That's obviously going to be situation dependent. And again, we're going to do everything we can, but if we have a widespread hit to the city, we're going to be prioritizing immediate life safety. I mean, period. It has to be. And unfortunately, difficult triage decisions have to be made on what limited resources we have got. So that's why we so strongly encourage people to try to take care of themselves as long as they can, because we have a lot of other issues we're trying to deal with. I'll tell you, I've been quite heartened during the last ice storm we had here of any real consequence to 109, how I had neighbors calling our EOC when we were open and saying, hey, look, I've got elderly neighbors. They don't want to be a burden. They say they're going to be fine. They don't want to cause any trouble, but I know they're old. They've been in there for 5 days with no power. Could you come look at them? It's like, yeah, we sure did. And we scooped them. And I think we took them to a shelter, so being tied into your community. Again, FEMA recommends a 72-hour preparedness capability. I mean, I probably don't. Well, I do. I probably got enough boxed food and canned goods and things you push in the back of the cupboard that I could live off of. But seriously, there are some real critical basic items which we'll talk about that I think this is an example of one of the commercially available kits, and there's gazillions of them out there. This one's even got water in it, first aid, a wide variety of things. And again, it depends upon where you live. In Florida, I didn't have to worry about packing warm clothes in my kit. I didn't own anything heavier than a long sleeve t-shirt before I joined the Navy. So, but in the winter here for evacuation, things of that sort, road travel in the winter, clearly, as we have seen a lot this year, 12, 14-hour strandings on interstates. But in general, 72 hours, the biggest thing you got to have obviously is water or something to drink. Again, it just depends on your circumstances. It's good to keep a case of water around, and water does go bad, believe it or not. It has an expiration date. So usually I like to recommend when you have the time change every year, it's every 6 months. It's a good time to check your smoke detector. Good time to check your carbon monoxide detector, clean your filters in your HVAC, and check the stuff in your preparedness kit if you're maintaining one. That way it's just kind of built in, when we do the time changes. But that's just a potential option. What do we got? Okay. Warning methods. Obviously, the warning method business has changed drastically just in the 17 years I've been doing this, primarily because of the smartphone and the proliferation of apps. And I cannot stress how well those work. However, they are contingent upon having a cell network. So depending upon the type of disaster, if you lose your cell phone tower network, and even many people's broadband internet that they get through a box and a Wi-Fi, that goes over the air somewhere. It's not all a cable. It's going to go to a broadcast tower somewhere before it goes back to cable. So this doesn't necessarily always get you out of the jam. There are other assets like the NOAA weather radios. That's a analog radio broadcast that sets these off. They're quite useful. And the new ones are so much easier to use. They're not hard to program. And as I said, we have an initiative right now where I'm going to be giving out about 1,400 of them, one to every mobile home in this county. And we actually are partnering with Kentucky Ready Corps to get some people to help us do that initiative. The emergency alert system, which is also tied from the federal government and goes out to the weather radio. We at a local level now do have a capability called IPAWS and WEA, WEA is widespread emergency alert. Bottom line is, the city of Lexington, after going through extensive training, we now have the ability to plug into the big federal system that can override everybody's phone, all TV, all radio, and we can blast out emergency messages. It's a new initiative. It's been around for about 10 years. We got qualified about 5 years ago. It's an absolute extreme emergency. You cannot use it, unless it's an extreme emergency, because it basically gives Lexington access to the FCC networks that control all broadcast media and phones. And we can override everybody's phone and send a message if we had to. Some of you may have received those, not from us necessarily, but the feds will put them out like flood warnings. You get a real annoying loud on your phone with a message. That's the federal government using the WEA system, and we can use that too. But again, it's only as good as if you have power and you have something on, but they're quite effective. Local TV and radio is very dialed in. They will stay on air. They have satellite broadcasting. They're not going to get knocked out. They're very good. We maintain extremely close relationships with our people here, and assist them in getting the word out, and they approach us to get our word out. Cable interrupt system, that's kind of an old school term now. We don't really have traditional cable anymore. Pretty much everything's IP comms. We do have a weather state. We do have the weather correction. We have a warning siren system here in Lexington. I believe most counties probably do. Just depends on where they're at. Lexington also has an emergency AM radio broadcaster here in our building. We have our own station called AM 1620. We have a generator backup radio transmitter, so we can record tailored messages and send them out, and redundantly. So we, having that, the ability to get the word out. I tell you right off the bat, local TV, your phone, keep a NOAA weather radio, and I think you're doing pretty well. I'll go quickly on some threats. I think a lot of this is self-explanatory. For tornado threats, the only thing you can do with a tornado is get to the lowest possible point in your house, farthest away from windows and doors. That's as quick as I can say it. Now, if you don't have a basement, get in the most interior part of your house that's got a lot of structure around you. You don't want exposure to glass and windows. The majority of tornado injuries are what we call missile injuries. They're being struck by glass, being struck by debris, being struck by splintered wood. So you want to get as far away from the outside as you can. If you do have a basement, that's the best. I know this sounds pretty like common sense. I cannot tell you how many people we get out of cars who say, well, I didn't think the puddle was that deep, and we're telling them, we're going to have some limited flash flooding. If you can't see the road, don't drive through it. Well, everybody thinks they got a 4-wheel drive minivan and can get through it. And you'd be surprised how quickly a car can get floating. And we have it happen here occasionally. And it shows you some of the statistics on how much water it takes to sweep you off your feet. In 2006, we had that 150-year flood here in Lexington, and we got like 6 inches overnight, and the whole region did. But downtown Lexington, this is before our sanitary sewer or our storm sewer upgrades that we did, got completely flooded in areas. I'm talking waist deep, fast moving water. We had 2 students from the University of Kentucky coming back from a late night of out in the local area, walking back to their dorm. We're trying to cross Alumni Drive. We even had, warning signs up and tape, hey, high water. They figured they could walk across it anyway, stepped into it. It snatched them both, put them in a storm drain, and we found their bodies about a day later, further down into town. People have no appreciation, unless you've seen it, how powerful and how strong water is. So the biggest thing is stay away from it. Don't get into it. You'd be surprised how simple and how quickly a car will get moving. We've talked about hazmat. Obviously in Lexington, we have a little bit higher risk for the reasons I've stated previously. Biggest thing will be, we will communicate this immediately via our emergency alert system. If it's a threat to life, our health and life, we will, within about 15 minutes, we're going to be blasting things out to the affected area. We'll probably override cell phones. We'll immediately contact the media. They'll start blasting everything out. Our ability to turn around information quickly through our media is fantastic here. And since we are a market, we have 3 independent broadcast systems here that we can get our word out very fast. If you're told to shelter in place, which we'll talk about here in a second, if there's anything you take away from my advice, if you're told you're in a hazardous materials threat situation and you're told, to stay home, shut off your air conditioning and close your windows. That's the fastest. Now there are a lot of more detailed steps you can take. You can hermetically seal your room with tape and plastic and all that, and that's great. But if you shut off your HVAC and close your windows and your doors, you have removed, statistically, 90% of the threat. just by doing that. So that final 10%, great. But if you can just shut your windows and doors, for those of you who live around the depot, I think you're probably quite aware of this training. And we include it in our CERT training and a lot of our public information. This is important. Now, you know, I've got grandkids that are in high school now, and on any given day, my daughter and her kids are spread to the four corners of Central Kentucky, you know, either up in Lexington, going to a game. My daughter works in Wilmore. Everybody's spread out everywhere, right? It's not like, you know, when I was a kid, you got on your bike and that was the extent of your mobility because your mom wouldn't take you anywhere. You know, now we've got our kids are out doing practice, they're at school, they're doing whatever. When disasters hit when families are separated, that's becoming more and more of an issue. All right. And that's why it's important to kind of have a plan. You know, hey, if we're not home, go to grandma's house. Or hey, if we can't get a hold of each other because the phones are down, let's all meet over at Southern States. I mean, pick something. You know, that's been a remarkable, effective planning process to just agree to places to meet or agree to other family members or friends you will contact to get information, because it happens. You know, something hits, kids are at school, mom's at work, mom, dad's at work, can't connect with each other, phones are down. Okay, how are we going to all link up? You know, so that's kind of pretty good. In addition to identifying your safe spaces for tornadoes, for sheltering in place for storms and things of that sort, and also evac planning. You know, if you have a fire, hey, how are we going to get out of the house? Where are we going to go? We're going to meet at Mrs. Jones's house across the street, because I may end up leaving through the basement. You may end up leaving through the upstairs window. Let's all meet over here. You know, just that kind of thinking through. In case of a broader, wider scale disaster in the area, an out-of-town contact is an outstanding idea. And that is something that the Red Cross has been doing a lot, because it may be difficult to get contact into the county, but you know, if you can call somebody out of county, out of state, and say, hey, look, I'm okay. You know, if people are looking for me, I'm fine. I'm in a shelter. You know, it may be more difficult to pass that information around locally, but it's always a good idea to have an out of county or an out of state contact. Plan for your pets. It's actually federal law for us. We have to have ability to make accommodations for domestic animals in all of our sheltering now. It's a big lift, I can tell you, big lift. Got to feed them, keep them from biting other people. You know, nothing is as calm as a scared cat, right? You deal with about a dozen of them. You know, so but we have systems and programs. We try to keep the animals with their provider as best as we can. We have a very good relationship with the animal care and control system here in Central Kentucky to take in animals from affected counties if possible, but it is federal law. And it's also smart because you know the old saying, grandma's not leaving her house unless Fluffy can come with her. And that's not a joke. That the change in federal law about animals in large part came partly after Hurricane Katrina. And people said they would not leave if they couldn't take their dog. You know, to some people, that dog is all they got left, and they're not going to go anywhere without that dog. And then the person succumbed. You know, so it's a horrible example on the extreme, but it is a fact and something we have to plan for. Here's another example of a commercial kit. We actually give these away as prizes for certain stuff throughout the year. This is not one that I'm endorsing. I can't endorse that. I'm a government employee. All I will say is that there are a bunch of these out there, but it's also not hard to make them. All right. Get a couple 5-gallon buckets, which also, by the way, double as a luxurious ensuite bathroom if you need it. That's the other advantage of putting your stuff in buckets. Not to be direct, but keep your stuff stored. You know, here's a list of some of the the basics: comms, first aid, batteries. I'll tell you now, the biggest thing is, you know, with most of our electronic devices, have an adapter for your car. Most of them do. You know, you can go out and charge stuff on your car, your radio, for example. IP or computer communication if you've got a network up. To me, the biggest saving for me has been my 12-volt chargers in my car. I have flashlight, radio, phone. So worst case, I can do that. Brick batteries are outstanding. I mean, we have brick batteries now that could jumpstart trucks. And if you have a brick battery like that and keep it charged, that thing will power a phone for 12 hours, so as a power issue and getting information. We used to always say, get a radio. That's great. Still a good idea. In case networks go down, on-air broadcast of analog radio will still work. So, and again, these are just some of the other issues to think about. Cash is a biggie because ATMs go down. You'd be shocked how many first thing people do is run to the ATM or go pay for gas in a disaster. Well, guess what? I saw that in Mayfield dramatically. There was no way to buy anything unless you had cash. And even then, some of the places couldn't take cash because they didn't have the accounting method to track it. I ended up having to go to Benton or Murray to get gas. It wasn't that they didn't have gas, but there was no way to turn on the pump without an ATM machine, and the ATM network was down and the point of sale network was down. So that's becoming more and more of an issue. Some other example. Yeah, keep it handy. Refresh it every 6 months. Again, I like when the time changes. I do everything when the time changes. Smoke detectors, my HVAC filter. My preparedness stuff is usually pretty good to go anyway, because I always have a package for myself to deploy, like I had to do to Mayfield. But if you're going to be traveling in the winter, especially, this is a biggie. Have a little bit of food, a little bit of water, have blankets, if nothing else, extra blankets. I doubt it. I mean, you're not surprised at how many people you can imagine we had stranded on the interstates all over the eastern and upper Midwest this last winter, where it got dicey. Eventually, you run out of gas, and if they can't move you or get to you for 12 hours, have the ability to stay warm as a minimum, and some water and some non-perishable snacks. It's a good idea to keep with you in the car. Real quick, final slides. What are some outreach and opportunities? We have a very robust CERT program here. We run it twice a year normally. We're just now restarting it after COVID. Because of the hospital systems here, we exercise with the hospital staff. We don't have enough firefighters to evacuate University of Kentucky Hospital if something happened. We don't have enough firefighters. So we actually train not just the nurses, but the security people, the maintenance guys. We've procured equipment that the average person can use to help evacuate patients. And we've actually spread that all around the region under a regional grant. Just as an example of specific type of training and preparedness things, we do here. As far as preparedness opportunities, number one, start with your local emergency management officer. Now, I understand, and I know Victoria was mentioning down in Boyle County, they've had a changeover, but try there first, okay? Because by KRS and just by common sense, that's where these programs are supposed to be coordinated out of. And again, it varies. Some counties have a part-time person, one person. I sympathize. There are other CERT programs, as we mentioned, or regional CERT. Occasionally, you can look into that. There's a lot of online FEMA training. It's not all hands-on training necessarily in preparedness. There's a lot of online independent study things you can learn through FEMA, about planning and preparedness and things of that sort. VOAD, which is an umbrella term, volunteers and organizations active in disasters. You guys are a VOAD. Okay, whether you realize it or not. VOAD is a national federal level term. It includes any entity that is involved in assisting in a disaster. Okay. World Central Kitchen, whom you've seen on TV, the chef, Andres, probably going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. He's feeding people in Ukraine right now. He was feeding us in Mayfield in December. Just to give you an idea, the impact that some of these VOADs can have. Red Cross, pick one, Appalachian Rescue Missions. There's all kinds that are out there that are looking for volunteers in addition to Ready Corps. You guys are already sold. I don't got to sell it to you because you're already in Ready Corps. But if you can't find a local office to help you because of your community, then the other VOADs, and then of course Ready Corps. But for certain things of that sort, it's pretty much administered generally through local government, or I'll give you Toyota. The Toyota plant in Georgetown, they have their own CERT because they're big enough. So some large companies have decided to get together and do CERT training. And that's something that maybe if you have the ability to influence that at your work, whether it's technically CERT, come up with a group of people who are gonna, help respond to disasters for their coworkers and their facility, We have aggressive outreach. Obviously, I have the staff to do that. You know, not everybody does. So we have a full-time preparedness coordinator, full-time public information person. I have a full-time planning officer. So, but this is our big push right now, this time of year in March, is we're doing severe storm preparedness because of the tornado risk. Obviously, I hate to say that word, but it's out there. My last comment, and then I'll leave a couple minutes for questions. Mitigation and preparedness, okay? This is the industrial park on the southwest edge of Mayfield in Graves County. All right. A lot of light industrial construction. At the bottom of the screen, Hudson. It's actually they sell gigantic John Deere combines and harvesters. You know, because out western Kentucky, it's a lot flatter, so it's more like Iowa type farm equipment where it's as big as your house. I mean, immense equipment. Huge poultry producing factories that are out there. There was something like 1.5 million chickens were in that Pilgrim's Pride building to the left. All right. Now, as far as preparedness, Mayfield knew it was coming. Their siren systems worked. They had 2 passes of tornadoes. One went through at about 5:30, just missed them. It tore up some other areas. Everybody went back to work. About 11 o'clock, next one came in. I was watching this on radar. I could tell what catastrophe it was going to be. We have a pretty high-end radar system at my work. And I didn't know about the candle factory. I'd never heard of the town of Mayfield, but I could tell that that county was going to get smashed. Tornadoes went off, sirens went off again. So the people in town knew it was coming. So this wasn't necessarily really a failure in warning or preparedness. What it was an EF4 tornado. All right. Now, there are just certain things that no matter what you prepare for. This is the same industrial park the next 2 days later. All right. That candle factory was about 100 yards by 100 yards square. 110 people were on duty. In the far right of the screen, in the right hand corner of that property, you see that pile. I don't know how to. I can't. Can you guys see my cursor when I do this? Okay, Roger that. You see this right here? That's about 80 cars that are smashed like Coke cans. The parking lot was over here. And we got there that night. This is an embankment. All these cars, for the most part, had been smashed into a pile up against this. So you couldn't even tell individual cars apart. That's how violent it was. Eventually we moved them all over there because of the hazmat issues. But I guess my point is, something's happened. Now, there are issues about should they've gone home, whatever. That's a separate issue. But the city was prepared. They knew it was coming. But some things you just can't mitigate. And that's why you got to be prepared at home. I've honestly, I mean, I've been to war. I've seen hurricanes. I don't think I've ever seen destruction so total as I saw here. But thankfully, people said we heard about it. We got the word. I went to my so-and-so's house because I live in a trailer. You know, people did what they could, but just sometimes it happens. So that's why it's important to be prepared, have a plan. These people had no comms, no phone. They just couldn't, you know, but they were making do, and they're going to continue. So that's really all I've got. I'm sorry, I might have cut us a little. If you have a hard 12:30 cutoff, I'm fine. But either way, that's all I've got.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. We really appreciate all this information, and you've given us a lot to think about. You know, obviously we want to open it up if people do have questions for you, but I had a couple people message me, and I just wanted to sort of recap what you've been saying, because, you know, in the context of the Western Kentucky tornadoes, this has been on a lot of people's minds. They maybe aren't necessarily thinking about flooding or you know, storms and ice, but, you know, this is all part of the disaster cycle. And if I understand what you're saying, you know, when people are saying, what can I do? What can I do? It sounds like a lot of it is being prepared, having a plan, being connected within your community to the people who are part of that organization. Is that accurate?
100%. I mean, that's a perfect summary. If I had to do the executive summary, you know, it starts at home. Be prepared. Understand what your community is doing. You know, get smart on your emergency operations plan in your county. That's publicly available. It has to be your mitigation plan. What are the assets? What is the city's plan? You know, especially from a volunteer perspective, after you take care of yourself and your family. I can't emphasize that enough. And everybody thinks, hey, I'm going to run to the gunfire or run to the disaster. Make sure your family's squared away first, you know, because you're not going to be able to stay focused. I always do. I say, hey, I got to go. Is there anything y'all need? I think we're set. I'll try to get a hold of you when I can. If you have trouble, you know, I have a network of coworkers and friends. We would look out for each other's families if I get deployed or, you know, we have to do something. But especially with our police and firefighters, you know, if you got to go online for 24 hours straight as a firefighter, you know, you need to make sure your family's taken care of and prepared.
Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Anybody else have any questions or thoughts they want to share? I know Holly has shared in the chat that there is a survey to complete. She's got a link here. Please take a look at that link. And thank you, Tim. I think we got a lot out of today. And I appreciate the distinction between mitigation and preparedness. And you know, the thing about preparedness, I think that is important for our members to know is that's the part that you can do most easily and most quickly. And the mitigation is something that you want to be aware of. And you know, you might be able to do your own mitigation within your own home. You know, you might have trees that are kind of not in great shape, and maybe they should be
Bingo.
You know, maybe they should be trimmed up a little bit so that when the windstorm blows through, it doesn't fall on your house. You know, so we as citizens should be prepared to take care of ourselves. That way, the other thing I think that's important, Tim, and I think you've touched on it, is that, you know, if we're prepared, then we don't have to call the emergency management to say, hey, I'm out of power. Well, we know everybody's out of power, but we're prepared because we have extra batteries or we have flashlights or we have, you know, so by us being prepared, we can eliminate overburdening organizations that are trying to respond because just a few more of us are prepared.
Preach it. We push that all the time, you know, and you're able to take care of your, you know, your friends or neighbors or family, you know, if you're squared away as best you can, and just being prepared. And nowadays, there is no reason ever to be surprised by weather. You know, when I hear someone say, well, I didn't know it was coming, well, you've been living in a cave 48 hours. I mean, you know what I mean? It's just, it's too easy to stay up to speed now, you know, and, you know, you know, recently Mayor Gordon, we had a couple rounds of some heavy snow, and we generally know this is coming 48, 72 hours. I mean, because we professionally, that's what I do for a living. And I work with the Weather Service. We figure, you know, and we talked to the mayor, and as a mitigating measure, you know, we cut people out of work about 10 a.m. because we knew that by noon, it was going to be disastrous snow. And not only would that be inconvenient, it would impact our ability to, you know, get fire trucks down the road, stuff like that, you know. So being prepared and being aware where to get information, like I said, to me, there is nobody should be surprised by weather, you know. That's a biggie. But the other thing is understand the risks around you. Do you work next to a factory? Does it have hazardous material? You know, that's a publicly available plan by law, actually, you know, through the SARA and the EPCRA systems. So, but that's the biggie. You know, if you're prepared, you're going to be able to help the problem, not contribute to it. I think that's the way I would put it in my military mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, excellent. All right, well, if you guys don't have any more questions, it is 12:34. So we want to thank Tim for being with us today and providing some really useful and helpful information that hopefully everybody will take to heart and start getting those plans together. And, you know, as Tim said, there aren't always CERT programs in your area, but there are things that you can still do within your community. And you know, yourself being prepared, but through first aid training or CPR training or something like that is in some cases what you can do. some of the online FEMA trainings, so you can learn how to help man a volunteer reception center, or you can
Yeah.
learn how to, if you're really interested, there's a Baptist group that does, chainsaw work and all those kinds of things. So there are
Yeah.
people that you can get affiliated with, your local VOADs we've talked about before. If there's a particular interest that you have, I think Pat mentioned before, if you're a photographer, they always need people to come out and take pictures, so for their insurance purposes and things like that. So lending your skills and looking at what your interests are and trying to plug yourself in, those are some of the things that we're going to help you guys do in these next, in the last of our series, is kind of thinking about, okay, these are the things I know how to prepare myself. I'm going to do that. I can do a few mitigating risk things around my particular house. Or my neighborhood, or whatever that might be. But what I really can't do is take my skills or my interests and find a way to be a part of my community response. And we're going to talk about that in our last event, in our last session. And so just keep that in mind and be thinking about the kinds of things that you guys are interested in. And hopefully the next time we meet, we'll have some people ready to put down some plans and find ways for them to get involved in their communities.
Thanks,
Thank
Tim.
you guys very much.
Thanks, everyone. We will share a recording of the presentation as well as the slides with everyone so you can follow along. We appreciate your participation and hope we've given you some stuff to think about. The final training is going to be on Wednesday, April 20th. So that's 6 weeks from now. So just think about that. If you have any questions in the meantime, you can always reach out to Holly, Carrie, or myself. Thank you all. Stay safe. Have a great day.
Survey. Thank you, Tim.